In the winter of 1849, somewhere along a frozen stretch of the Oregon Trail, a man lay dying inside a canvas tent, his leg shattered beneath a wagon wheel. There was no hospital for 1,000 miles. No anesthesia. No antibiotics. No X-ray to show the break. Just a man with a leather bag, a bottle of whiskey, and a saw. What happened next would decide whether that settler lived to see spring, and stories like his played out across the American frontier tens of thousands of times, in cabins, in army forts, in mining camps clawed out of the mountains. This is the story of the men and women who practiced medicine at the edge of the known world, armed with almost nothing, and somehow, against every odd, kept the nation alive long enough to build itself. To understand frontier medicine, you first have to understand just how little medicine actually meant in the 19th century. Germ theory did not exist yet in any form doctors trusted. Louis Pasteur would not publish his findings until the 1860s, and even then, it took decades for the idea to cross the ocean and settle into everyday American practice. Doctors on the frontier had no concept of bacteria. They did not know that washing their hands between patients could save lives. Many surgeons prided themselves on coats stiffened with old blood, wearing the stains like a badge of experience rather than a warning sign. It sounds almost unbelievable today, but a surgeon's dirty hands were, without exaggeration, one of the deadliest tools in the American West. So who were these people, and how did they end up out here, hundreds of miles from any city, expected to treat everything from snakebite to childbirth to gunshot wounds with almost no training at all? The truth is that the word doctor on the frontier covered an enormous and often unsettling range of skill. Some had genuinely attended medical schools back east, in Philadelphia or New York, sitting through a single year, sometimes less, of lectures before receiving a diploma. Formal medical education in this era was shockingly brief compared to today's standards, often just a few months of classroom instruction repeated for a second term, with little to no supervised clinical practice. A man could, in theory, walk out of a lecture hall having barely touched a human body and call himself a physician. Others learned entirely through apprenticeship, following an older doctor from house to house for a year or two before striking out on their own. And still others had no training whatsoever. They were self-taught herbalists, veterinarians who treated people on the side, midwives who had delivered dozens of babies without a single hour of formal instruction, or simply the most literate person in a town who happened to own a copy of a home medical guide. This meant that the quality of care a settler received depended enormously on luck. A family in one town might have access to a genuinely skilled surgeon who had trained under a respected mentor. A family 50 miles away might be relying on a man who had once worked as a blacksmith and picked up bone setting from watching others do it. And then there were the outright frauds, the traveling salesmen who rolled into town with wagons full of brightly labeled bottles, promising cures for everything from baldness to cancer. These so-called patent medicines dominated the frontier medical marketplace, often more visible and more trusted by ordinary people than actual physicians. Many of these tonics contained alcohol, opium, or cocaine, which meant they did, in a very real sense, make the patient feel better, at least temporarily, and at a steep hidden cost. It's a strange and uncomfortable truth of this era. Some of the most popular medicines in America were closer to addictive drugs than treatments, and nobody regulating their sale. Now picture the world these doctors, real or fraudulent, actually worked in. There was no ambulance. No emergency room. If you were a settler and something went wrong, a difficult birth, a ruptured appendix, a rattlesnake bite, you might have to ride for hours, sometimes an entire day, just to reach anyone who could help. And by the time you arrived, it might already be too late. This single fact shaped nearly everything about frontier survival. Communities didn't just need doctors, they desperately needed people, anyone, with enough knowledge to act in the critical first hour after an injury, because that first hour, more than any hospital hundreds of miles away, was what usually decided who lived and who didn't. This is why so much frontier medicine fell not to trained physicians at all, but to ordinary women. Frontier wives and mothers were, in practice, the true backbone of medical care in rural America. They ran the sickroom. They knew which plants could ease a fever, which poultices might draw infection from a wound, how to set a broken finger, how to deliver a baby when no midwife could be reached in time. This knowledge was passed down mother to daughter, generation to generation, an oral tradition of practical medicine that rarely appeared in any official record but that likely saved more frontier lives than university-trained doctors ever did. It's a part of this story that history books have often overlooked, but it deserves to be front and center. Let's talk about surgery, because if there is one image that captures the sheer brutality of frontier medicine, it's the amputation. Anesthesia did exist by the middle of the 19th century, ether was first publicly demonstrated in 1846, and chloroform followed shortly after, but access to it on the frontier was wildly inconsistent. In a proper city hospital, a surgeon might have ether readily available. In a remote outpost or a wagon train stalled on the plains, a doctor might have nothing stronger than whiskey, and sometimes not even that. Patients were often held down by 2 or 3 strong men while the surgeon worked as fast as humanly possible, because speed itself was a form of mercy. A skilled amputee surgeon might complete a leg removal in well under 2 minutes, not out of carelessness, but because every additional second was another second of unbearable, fully conscious agony for the person on the table. Infection, not the surgery itself, was usually the real killer. A wound that seemed to heal in the first few days could turn deadly a week later once infection set in, and without antibiotics, which would not exist until the 20th century, doctors had almost no way to fight it once it took hold. They tried anyway. Some frontier physicians, entirely independent of formal germ theory, noticed that cleaner instruments and fresher bandages seemed to produce better outcomes, even if they didn't fully understand why. This kind of hard-won, trial-and-error observation is one of the quietly remarkable threads running through frontier medicine, people building real, life-saving knowledge without ever having the scientific framework to explain what they were seeing. Disease was, in many ways, a far greater threat than any gunfight or wagon accident. Cholera swept through wagon trains along the Oregon and California trails with terrifying speed, sometimes killing a person within hours of the first symptoms appearing. Entire families could be wiped out in a single day. Dysentery, typhoid fever, and diphtheria moved through frontier towns and army posts with similarly devastating consequences, made worse by contaminated water sources and the complete absence of any understanding of sanitation as we know it today. Army surgeons stationed at frontier forts kept meticulous records of these outbreaks, and reading them now is genuinely sobering, page after page of young soldiers and settlers lost not to combat, but to diseases that today would be treated with a simple course of medication. Smallpox deserves special mention here, because it reveals something important about how frontier medicine actually did make progress, even in the middle of chaos and superstition. Vaccination against smallpox, using cowpox material, had been developed by Edward Jenner back in 1796, and by the frontier era, the practice had slowly spread westward, carried by traveling doctors and army physicians. It wasn't universally accepted, there was real public suspicion and resistance to the idea of deliberately introducing something into the body to prevent disease, but where it was practiced, it worked, and it stands as one of the few genuinely modern medical tools available to frontier communities. Childbirth, meanwhile, remained one of the single most dangerous events a woman could go through, doctor or no doctor. Maternal mortality was staggeringly high by modern standards. There was no understanding of the importance of sterile technique during delivery, and puerperal fever, an infection following childbirth, killed countless women in the days after giving birth, often because the very person assisting the delivery had gone straight from another patient, or even from performing an autopsy, without ever washing their hands. It is one of the darkest ironies of this era, the person trying hardest to save a mother's life could, without any malicious intent whatsoever, be the one who ended it. Native American medicine also played a far larger role in frontier healthcare than most popular retellings of this history acknowledge. Indigenous peoples across North America possessed extensive, sophisticated knowledge of local plants, their medicinal properties, and treatment techniques developed over countless generations of careful observation. Many settlers, out of necessity or genuine respect, learned from native healers, adopting remedies for everything from wound care to fever reduction. Certain plant-based treatments used by indigenous communities were later recognized by Western medicine as genuinely effective, containing compounds that modern pharmacology would eventually isolate and understand. This exchange of knowledge, though rarely credited fairly in historical accounts, was a real and significant thread in how frontier communities survived. Army post surgeons occupied a unique position in this world. Stationed at forts scattered across the Western territories, they were often the closest thing to a true, formally trained physician for hundreds of miles in any direction, and civilians would frequently travel to a fort specifically to seek their help, even though the surgeon's primary responsibility was technically only to the soldiers stationed there. These men treated an extraordinary range of conditions, from combat wounds to the same diseases ravaging civilian wagon trains, and their detailed medical journals remain one of the richest surviving records of what frontier illness and injury actually looked like, day to day, in this period of American history. By the later decades of the 19th century, change was slowly arriving, even in the most remote corners of the frontier. News of Joseph Lister's work on antiseptic surgery in Britain, along with Pasteur's germ theory research, began reaching American medical journals and, eventually, filtering down to frontier practitioners, though the process was gradual and deeply uneven. Some doctors adopted these new ideas quickly, cleaning instruments and wounds with carbolic acid the moment they read about it. Others resisted for years, sometimes decades, clinging to older methods out of habit, skepticism, or simple lack of access to updated information. The line between the old world of frontier medicine and the modern medicine we recognize today wasn't a single dramatic moment. It was a slow, uneven dawn, arriving at different speeds in different places, town by town, doctor by doctor. What's remarkable, looking back at this entire era, is not how much frontier doctors got wrong, and they got a great deal wrong, but how much they managed to accomplish with almost nothing at all. They set bones without X-rays to guide them. They performed surgery without any real understanding of infection. They delivered babies, fought epidemics, and treated gunshot wounds using instincts, folk knowledge, borrowed wisdom from indigenous healers, and sheer determination. Many of them were wrong about why their treatments worked, when they worked at all. But their willingness to act, in the absence of certainty, in the absence of proper training, in the absence of anything resembling a modern hospital, kept entire communities alive long enough for real medical science to eventually catch up with them. The frontier doctor, in the end, wasn't defined by expertise. Very few of them had much of it, by today's standards. What defined them was a willingness to show up, to ride for hours through the night to reach a dying patient, to hold a saw steady while a man screamed beneath them, to try something, anything, when the alternative was simply to watch someone die. It was messy. It was often deadly. And it was, in its own imperfect way, one of the most quietly heroic chapters in American history. If you had lived on the American frontier in the 1800s, and there was no hospital for 100 miles, who would you have trusted to save your life? The university-trained doctor with a diploma he barely earned, or the woman down the road who had delivered 40 babies with nothing but her own hands and years of hard-won experience? Tell us who you would have chosen, and why.